Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and thank you so very much for joining me this evening. I hope you're doing incredibly well and that you've had a fantastic day or are about to have a fantastic day, depending on what your time zone is where you are. And I'm just sending you loads of love and hope you're doing great. But before we get relaxed and comfortable listening to a new story, I just want to remind those of you who haven't subscribed, please do so. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story that comes to us all the way from Michigan. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I grew up in a tiny little apartment block in New York in the early 80s, and I was raised by my single mother, who was sadly estranged from her only living family member, a sister called Emma. She told me that when she was a young girl, she was very much in love with Robert, the boy that she'd been dating for over 3 long years, who was now, believe it or not, my uncle. One day, Robert and her sister Emma started to see each other in secret behind my mother's back. My mother was left with her heart totally broken, seemingly betrayed by the 2 people that she had loved and trusted more than anybody else in the world. Emma, her sister, was now married to Robert, and they lived in Michigan, and that was all I actually knew. As you can imagine, after my mother found out about her sister's horrible betrayal, she was utterly mortified, and she moved away and settled far away in New York, away from her family home in Michigan. She chose to cut off all ties with her sister Emma, who she had not spoken to for years. I was born a month or 2 after my mother arrived in New York. My mother never told me who my father was. I didn't ask either, because every time I brought up the subject, I could see that dire, sad despondency in her eyes, and she would look at me and say, "Pete, I'd rather not talk about that if you don't mind. It hurts too much." My mother worked during the day as a secretarial assistant for a local kitchen company, and money was always tight, because living in New York, even in those days, was never cheap, and the rent for our sizable apartment consumed much of my mother's income. My mother never dated again, because I think she had lost total faith in humanity, and I was the only person in the world that she allowed into her heart, and she loved the bones off me. I truly became her world, and as far as she was concerned, nothing outside me actually mattered. One day I came home from school and I put my satchel on the counter and I called out, "Mum! Mum, are you there?" I could suddenly hear all this whispering going on in the kitchen, and then I very distinctly heard a male voice saying, "I'll deal with this, all right?" My heart started to thump violently in my chest, because I sensed something was erroneously wrong. Then I saw a policeman coming through the kitchen door and beckoning for me to sit down on my mother's cosy couch. My face went as white as a sheet, and I said, "Please, sir, where is my mother?" I was to learn that my mother had tragically died of a brain aneurysm at work, while she was taking an order for a client for a kitchen product. I gather she was talking 1 minute, and then gone the next. So if anything, I'm very glad that she did not suffer, and that her demise was very quick. In that instant, as you can imagine, my life changed very dramatically. Gone was my safe, secure life with my mother in a New York apartment, and I was immediately taken to live with a foster family with 10 other needy, very demanding foster kids, and my whole world just came crumbling down, shattering into thousands of pieces. I had never experienced the horrific emptiness of grief that I did now. I was absolutely devastated. I remember feeling so alone and all alone and lost in the world. I was told that I was going to live with Robert, my uncle, my Aunt Emma, and their son Timothy, who had chosen to adopt me as their child, and I was devastated, as you can imagine, by this revelation, because it would be like living with my sworn enemies. Unfortunately, the decision was not mine to make. The following day at about 8 a.m., I was driven from New York to Michigan, which took about 10.5 hours, and I arrived at my uncle's Michigan rather grand-looking farmhouse at about 7 p.m. It was all incredibly overwhelming. I was determined to hate them with every fibre of my being, but the moment I saw Emma, she reminded me so much of my mother, and when she cradled me in her loving arms, I just sobbed, and so did she. She kept saying to me, "I'm so sorry for all the dreadful hurt I've caused." I knew that her apology extended way beyond my mother's death, and so in that moment I chose to exonerate her from the hurt that she had caused my mother. It was when I met my cousin Timothy, I nearly did a double take. I could hardly believe that I was seeing myself in the mirror. That was what it was like. He looked exactly like me, and we were only a couple of months apart in age. It was like I was staring at my twin brother, and from that moment we were inseparable because we had similar interests and we had so much in common. My Uncle Rob wasted no time in ushering me into his office moments after I'd arrived. "I see no point in beating around the bush," he said, "so I'm going to say it as it is. I am your father." I was absolutely dumbfounded. "Are you sure?" I asked. "My mother never told me who my father was." "I am absolutely certain," he said, looking at me kindly and taking me lovingly into his arms in a warm, tender embrace. "I suspected you were mine, so I ran a DNA test on your hair that your foster mother removed from your hairbrush, very, very sneakily, I'm afraid. I just needed to see if you were mine to be sure. And you are, I'm very delighted to say." "Why did you cheat on my mother?" I said. "You really broke her heart. She loved you so much." I could see my father fighting back tears in his eyes. "I was younger then," he said, "foolish and easily flattered by Emma's advances. Now don't get me wrong, I love your Aunt Emma very much indeed. But your mother, she was the love of my life. I really blew it with her. I'm so sorry. And if I'd known she was pregnant with you, I would have fought a lot harder. She could not forgive me or Emma for my betrayal. And how can I blame her?" "Yes, but why did you do it in the first place?" I persisted. "You must have known it was wrong." "Oh, I did. I was young, that's all I can say. I'm not excusing my atrocious behaviour. I was just so easily led astray. I was young, with a very big ego. It had a lot to do with it, I'm afraid." I have to tell you, knowing that my mother had been the love of his life really made me so happy, and the animosity and hatred I felt towards my uncle and aunt soon dissipated, never to be remembered again. Fast forward a few months, and I was settled down into my beautiful country home in Michigan. My father lived on 250 acres of pristine land that was surrounded by some grazing pastures for his horses and extensive areas of tillable timber. A very large, picturesque silvery lake, a stunning lily-covered pond, along with various sheds and outbuildings. The rolling pastures of horizontal emerald green grass were relatively flat and uniform, but on the eastern side of the valley, next to an extensive wooded area that stretched back for miles, was an enormous hillock that I could not wait to use for tobogganing when winter came. Timothy, my brother, and I became as thick as thieves, and we would do absolutely everything together. I have to say I was beginning to love and adore life in the countryside. I loved the wide open spaces, the prepossessing views, the habitual wildlife from the deer to the rabbits, and the crisp country air. Emma and my father teased me as if I was their own son, and my father taught me everything I know today, from hunting to tracking to fishing. One day when winter had arrived, and the whole area was covered and carpeted in thick veils of white glistening snow, resembling an idyllic winter wonderland, Tim and I raced out into the snow with our toboggans, squandering no time at all to go riding down the huge hilly embankment. We were having so much fun, laughing and joking and riding up and down the high hill and screaming in delight, when I suddenly got the distinct impression that I was being watched. I did not want the person who was ogling me to know that I had seen them or sensed them, so I positioned my body in such a way as to get a good view of the individual through my peripheral vision, without them actually knowing. I could not believe what my eyes were actually seeing. Scrutinizing us with intense curiosity was a hairy humanoid ape that was at a guess at the very least about 8 to 9 feet tall. This creature looked just like a black bear, but his physical stature and his face were distinctly human-like. "We are being watched," I whispered to Tim, "but don't look." Tim continued to toboggan down the slope, but he was always trying to get a glimpse of the stranger without them knowing that we'd actually seen them. "What the heck is that?" he whispered to me as he climbed the toboggan to slide down the hill all over again. "I have no idea," I said, "but it's definitely not a bear, and it's not human either." The mystery creature, whatever he was, seemed to really enjoy watching us and what we were doing. He was intrigued, fascinated, and interested in us, but little did he know that we were secretly equally as curious and interested in him. Bear in mind, this was in the 80s, and we had no clue what this creature could possibly be. Once the hairy critter had turned around to walk away, Tim and I crept up to the hill and lay flat on the snow, watching the animal moving gracefully towards the woods on his long, agile thighs that manoeuvred across the snow seamlessly, almost as if he was wearing snowshoes, and he moved his arms backwards and forwards, almost as if he was marching. "What the heck?" said Tim again. "What the heck is that?" "Let's follow his trail," I said, "and find out where he lives. We could spy on him." Tim thought it sounded like a marvellous idea. He was equally as curious and fascinated by the creature as I was. "Come," I prodded, "let's go." "Look at this," said Tim, looking in horror at the large footprint in the snow. The foot impression was, I kid you not, at least 17 inches long and 10 inches wide. We both placed our tiny feet in the imprint, and they were swamped by the huge size of this foot impression that made our feet look minute by comparison. We could hear Emma calling us for lunch, but we weren't interested in food at all. Our hunger had been overtaken by an insatiable curiosity to follow this incredible creature, and that's exactly what we did. The creature's strides were utterly enormous. One of his footsteps was equivalent to 5 of our feet. We were flabbergasted. We followed the large trail of footprints into the sylvan area, and as they were so fresh, they were exceedingly easy to follow. Everything in the woods was quiet, made more still by the falling heavy snow. It was easy to spot the creature in this weather, because he was so black against the white snow. "There he is," I whispered to Tim. "Over there, see?" He was standing in an open clearing in the woods. We hid behind the girth of a very old tree trunk that provided an excellent hiding space to observe the creature closely, who was clearly oblivious to our presence. He was much larger than I'd actually imagined on closer inspection. We were much closer to him now, and I would say that he was about 1,000 pounds in weight and between 9 to 10 feet tall, not 8 to 9 as I had previously thought, and he was easily 5 feet wide. I was so impressed with this creature's torso because it was ripped and exceedingly muscular, and his arms were uncommonly long. He had a bullet-shaped head that flowed seamlessly onto a very wide pair of shoulders. I could see the creature had a dark, hairless face, flat nose, brown, sparkly, rusty-coloured eyes. I could not see those details as clearly as I would have liked. The creature was dragging stones away, and I guessed he was looking for a hibernating squirrel. Some of the stones he moved were rarely big, and it was effortless for him to lift them up in his arms. Soon he found what he was looking for, and he literally snapped the squirrel's neck in an instant. I truly think the squirrel would not have felt a thing, because its demise was so quick and merciful, and besides, it was probably half asleep. The hairy humanoid replaced the stones to where they originally stood, and started to play with the dead squirrel, as if it was a ball. He would throw it up into the air until it glided a fair way away, and then he would catch it. His movements were so agile and fast and athletic, and he never missed catching the squirrel once. I knew of no human that could do this, and I was so impressed. I just kept thinking to myself that I wished he was on our football team at school, because we would win every time against all our competitors. "See how he moves," marvelled Tim. "Have you ever seen anything that can move like that?" "It's incredible," I agreed. "But more to the point," I said, "what on earth is he? I never knew a creature like this existed." "I think there's definitely some great ape in him," said Tim. "Look at his lengthy arms and his conical face. He looks distinctly like an ape. We stood there spellbound, watching the creature in awe and disbelief, because we'd never heard of any documented accounts of a creature that looked exactly like this. The creature finally squatted down on a large boulder in the clearing, and we watched him tear open the squirrel and eat it like we would munch a hot dog. He sat there just chewing and hurled the carcass of the squirrel on the ground once he'd finished. He then got up, and to our amusement he started to whistle to himself, and he sounded exactly like a songbird that I'd often heard in the woods when we were hunting. "We better get back," I whispered, "because your mother will be sending out a search party by now. We can return again after lunch, and we'll see if he's still here." "Where have you boys been?" snapped Emma as we bolted down our cold spaghetti bologneses like ravenous Labradors. "Emma," I asked, "do you know anything about apes?" "What a very extraordinary question," asked Emma. "You're a lot like your mother, Pete, asking all these odd things all the time. Your mother was like that. What do you want to know exactly?" "Well, what do they eat apart from meat?" "What makes you think they eat meat?" asked Emma in surprise. "As far as I know, they like fruit. Well, that's what they feed them at the zoos anyway. Although I have heard that those monkeys you get in India will eat anything. Apparently they eat crisps and popcorns from the tourists in those places. Is there a possibility of an ape living here in Michigan?" My aunt hooted with laughter. "Tim, where did I find you?" "No," she giggled. "There are no primates in America. With an exception to the zoos, of course. If I take you to the zoo, you'll see one there." That afternoon, when Emma wasn't looking, we raided her pantry and her fruit bowls. We took bananas, apples, crisps, raisins, dates, peanuts, walnuts, raspberry jam, salted crisps, shortbread biscuits, and we went back to where we'd seen the humanoid ape. And sadly, he wasn't anywhere in the rocky clearing. We were somewhat disheartened, but we decided to hide the food stash under some of the rocks he had initially removed to look for that hibernating squirrel. We knew he would be coming back any time soon, perhaps for another squirrel, and then he would discover our secret food stash. At least that's what we hoped. We stayed hidden behind the girth of a large tree for about 3 hours, and were about to give up and to leave, when suddenly we heard the creature coming back, and there he was, larger than life. Once again the creature pushed away some heavy stones to look for yet again another squirrel. I guess he must have been hungry again. We watched him lifting up the stones, and then he came across our stash of food. The expression on his face was absolutely priceless. He looked so puzzled, as if he couldn't understand where the magic of the food had materialized from. He lifted all the rocks just to check he had not missed anything, and then he sat on the ground with all the goodies, looking as pleased as Punch, almost as if he'd just won the lottery. He started to shake the shortbread biscuits container curiously, examining the package closely with a look of awe on his face, and pulling away the cellophane. He then smelt the biscuit, examining it very carefully, and then taking a bite. And he seemed to be enjoying the taste because he kept smacking his lips together. Suddenly he looked very alert, just like a dog does when they're sure they've heard something. At that moment the creature looked terribly, terribly concerned. He then quickly hid all the goodies under the stone, just as another big creature appeared. I guessed it must have been its partner, because it was smaller than him, and it had furry breasts. He started chattering to the creature, and pointed to some stones far away from his food stash that we had given him, and he had surreptitiously hidden. He then chattered very excitedly, lifting up the rocks further away from the hidden food stash, and then he found another hibernating squirrel, which he killed instantly, handing it to the female while she squatted down to eat it. All the while he was doing this, he kept looking towards our hidden food stash with a look of very deep concern on his face. We both realized in amusement that this stash of food he had absolutely no intention of sharing with the female. Tim and I were giggling so much because it was so funny to watch. Once the female had eaten her squirrel and sauntered off, the creature went back to the hidden food stack just to make sure it was still there and had not magically just vanished. As he did this, he looked around cautiously, to the left, to the right, to the front, and to the back, to check that nobody was coming. and then he quickly rearranged some of the rocks over the food stash to make doubly sure that everything was very well hidden. He then ambled away with a look of very deep satisfaction on his face. That was the only time on the Michigan farm that we had such a close encounter with that beautiful creature that I now realize was actually a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, or a Yeti. One day when I was 21 years old, my brother Tim brought this beautiful girl home whom he had been dating. I knew that I would never do to my brother what my mother's sister had done to my mother, no matter how great the temptation. I am so glad I respected those boundaries, as Tim married the girl many years later. It was through Tim that I was to meet my wife Kate, who was her best friend, and it was quite literally love at first sight for both of us. So we married and had 3 children together. I still live in Michigan area on 300 acres of land with 2 farmhouses, one that belongs to me and the other to my brother. All these years later, we are still exceptionally close and still looking for another amazing encounter with the elusive beast that we call Bigfoot. So here is still hoping. Well, I just want to say thank you so very much for that amazing story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.